All right, guys, so this is the first of two videos we're going to do with the nervous system anatomy. These are going to be a little bit more detailed, a little enhanced, a little more detailed than what I'm going to actually expect you to know come time for our quiz on this unit. But I wanted to give you a little bit more here so you get really a feel for the nervous system, and then in class we'll kind of simplify it down a little bit. So let's jump right into it here. So I think all of this is going to be review. The nervous system is usually divided into two parts: the CNS, which is central nervous system, is the brain and the spinal cord, and we have the peripheral nervous system, which is your cranial nerves, and spinal nerves. So let's dive into the brain here. So the brain itself is composed of three big parts. You'll see them already listed here, right? So we've got the cerebrum, right? So we've got the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. We're going to talk about each of those individually and give you some detail about them as we go through this. So one other piece we want to kind of focus on is the fact that the brain is going to be surrounded by these meninges, which are essentially going to be membranes. When somebody has meningitis, that's inflammation of these meninges, those wrappings around the brain and spinal cord. And they kind of keep it separated. They keep it a little bit isolated and kind of protect the brain and spinal cord. And then there's also this cerebrospinal fluid, usually abbreviated as CSF. And that functions to be a kind of cushioning layer, as well as a little bit of controlling the chemical environment around the brain and some nutrients and wastes and things like that. So let's start by focusing on just the cerebrum, okay? So the big concept that I want to make sure you guys have out of the cerebrum is that it's everything that we're consciously aware of happens here, okay? So anything that you taste, smell, hear, all of that comes into the cerebrum, and that's where we process it and make sense of it and do all of those types of things. So structurally, the cerebrum is divided into right and left halves along what's called the longitudinal fissure. You'll see this when we do the sheep brain dissection. Each half is called a hemisphere. The surface of each hemisphere is composed of a layer of gray matter. Remember that gray matter is going to not have myelin. So the signals are going to go much slower in gray matter. So anytime you see gray matter, you want to think of processing, right? So this is processing. Every time you see gray matter, think about something being processed, something being used, some information being thought about or made sense of. And that area is called the cerebral cortex. And the cortex, turns out it can't get thicker and maintain its processing power. So to get more gray matter, we kind of fold it in. So we increase the surface area, which allows us to pack more gray matter, more processing power into the brain as a result. All right, a couple other cool things that are nice to know about the cerebrum. The brain kind of works contralateral, which means opposite side. So everything that has to do with the right side of my body generally is located in the left side of the brain. So I want to move my right hand. It's the left side of my brain that does that. I want to feel something from my left foot. It goes to the left side of the brain. And then the other concept we want to focus on is this idea of lateralization. And most people have an organization where the left hemisphere ends up being what they refer to as the dominant hemisphere, where you have a lot of your reading and writing and math and decision-making, a lot of logic, those types of things. And then the opposite side, in most people's the right hemisphere, is where you have more like your sensory stuff, a little more facial recognition, a little more sometimes artistic side of things. And so you see this fairly consistent in people. All right, so you may have to pause this to get all the labels down, but I wanted to show you some of the major landmarks in it. And again, we're going to label these when we do the sheep brain. Let's look at the lobes first, right? So we're going to start with those. So at the front of the brain here, we have what's called the frontal lobe. Makes sense, right? Across the kind of top of the brain is the parietal. At the back, you have the occipital lobe. And along the side, kind of like where you would think of like your ears being kind of located, that's more the temporal lobe. The other two labels that I added in here, you have the cerebellum off the back, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then across the top here, we have what's referred to as the central sulcus. So a sulcus is a big groove goes through here. So I'm going to kind of color it green on this. So this groove that's going right down all the way down here is fairly consistent. A lot of these kind of squiggles that you see elsewhere, they're not like set from one person to the next, but you typically see the central sulcus in all human brains. And it divides the frontal lobe, right? We have the whole frontal here, and that parietal lobe behind it off on that side. Now, this is the part that I'm going to reduce a ton this year. This is what's referred to as the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. And so what you'll remember, the cerebral cortex is responsible for everything you're kind of aware of. So you have all of these areas that are kind of labeled in here, and they're mapped out, and they're fairly consistent from person to person. And then you'll see a second picture that looks like this with a couple more of these areas in. And then what you have here is a description of what these are. You have two slides that look like this and this, right? That go by lobe and kind of tell you what's found in each lobe. So in the frontal lobe, you have an area that's responsible for any voluntary movement, for like learned movements, for moving your hand. We aren't going to spend a ton of time on these guys. This is important if you were diagnosing like a stroke, because you can kind of like all of a sudden somebody loses the ability to speak, right? That's a Broca's area that's involved in that. You might know where the damage has been done. If all of a sudden somebody is having a difficulty with smell or hearing, they're typically located in the same spots over and over and over. So you can use this information. I'm not going to test you on this individual information. I used to have everybody kind of memorize it and kind of have to know all these things. I want you to know really that if you look at this list, this is everything that we are consciously aware of, right? So this is like our knowledge, this is speech, visual stuff, auditory, smell, visceral association, all of like your sensory information from your internal organs. My stomach's upset. All of your information like sense of touch, pressure, pain, vibration, temperatures, all of that's found in here. So everything that you're kind of aware of happens in this cerebrum, right? And so that's the big idea. And these are just a ton of different examples of some of the things that the cerebrum does for us. And here's just another little picture showing some of those things. So typically the speech area is going to be found in the left hemisphere in most people. The math portion of your brain can be here. So those types of things. So this is that lateralization idea that we talked about. And then the only other vocab that's kind of cool, and again, not going to show up in our unit this year, but it's kind of cool, is this idea of the corpus callosum. And we'll see it in the sheep dissection. But this is essentially the bridge that connects the two sides. You see these arrows going back and forth here. So that's how information from one hemisphere passes to the other hemispheres through that corpus callosum. All right, and this is going to be what's referred to as a mid-sagittal or a sagittal section that we talked about. So mid-sagittal means it's right down the middle. So here's that corpus callosum again. So we can pass it from right and left, and it kind of shows you the different lobes and the different pieces that we're looking at. Okay. What we're going to move into right now is we're going to focus in on the cerebellum next, and then we're going to make our way through this section here, which is going to be the brainstem. So we're going to kind of slowly make our way through those pieces. All right, so let's talk about the cerebellum then, right? So cerebellum is this, it's often referred to as the small brain below the occipital lobe. It's divided into two halves called hemispheres. Just like we had cerebral hemispheres, we now have cerebellar hemispheres. It's got gray matter on the outside. Again, gray matter for processing, right? So anytime you have gray matter, you want to think processing. And then that gray matter is referred to as the cerebellar cortex versus the cerebral cortex, right? And what does the cerebellum do? It adjusts your posture muscles, it fine-tunes your conscious movements of the body. And essentially what it does, guys, it makes small adjustments to every movement you make. So if I want to write something, my cerebellum, it takes in information about how I'm doing. Oh, I'm starting to drift too high, or I'm going too low with that, or my C is not quite rounded enough as I write something here. So as I write this word, my cerebellum is processing how I'm doing, and is it coming out the way it's supposed to be, and it will also send changes out to make sure that it is good as possible, right? So that's kind of what the cerebellum does, right? The best way to illustrate it, guys, most of you guys have seen somebody who's been drunk before, and alcohol immediately impairs the cerebellum, right? So a reason a person has a hard time walking in a straight line when they're drunk is because the brain can't fine tune the signals as quickly as they normally can. The reason a person slurs their words is as the cerebellum isn't fine tuning those movements for speech the way they normally would. And that's why it's so crazy that people drink and drive. It's because it impairs your movements to the point where it actually is challenging to move your foot from a gas to a brake pedal, and can lead to accidents. Here's just a little diagram of the cerebellum, and you can see the gray matter around the outside and the white matter on the inside. So the white matter is going to be the highway, sending it back and forth as fast as possible, and then this gray matter is where all the processing would take place. All right, so now we're going to work our way down through the brainstem. I'm going to go quickly through this because very little of this do we need to know this year. So this is the very top of the brainstem, two big portions. We got the thalamus, and the thalamus serves as the relay station for all the sensory information coming in. So everything but smell. Smell does not go through this. Does not go through this. Everything else comes up through the thalamus and gets sent to the right spot. So if we see something, it comes in, goes up the brainstem, and the thalamus sends it to where it's got to go. Touch sends it to the right area. Touch from my foot gets sent to a different area from touch from my hand, from my face. So this relay station is super important. Okay, and then the hypothalamus does tons of things. We learned about it with body temperature homeostasis earlier in the year. It's part of our sleep-wake cycle, which is often referred to as circadian rhythms. It's a lot of this autonomic responses, which is the very last thing we're going to talk about. Also things like hunger and thirst and sex drives. Sorry, there should be a little slash in there. And things like that. Making our way down the brainstem, the next thing we'd hit would be the midbrain. You'll see this old mesencephalon term occasionally, but midbrain is what most people use, so that's the one I'd have you focus on. This is for the auditory and visual reflexes. It's the way we respond to fast-moving objects, and we're like, oh, what is that? Or loud noises. We turn our head quickly to figure out what they are. Those are the auditory and visual reflexes. Then we have the pons, and that's our main respiratory center. So we're going to talk about that a lot more, how it does that when we do the respiratory system. The medulla oblongata, right? Often referred to as the vital reflex center. Vasomotor is opening and closing the blood vessels. Heart rate helps with breathing, helps the pons with the breathing. And then the last two areas that we have in here are the reticular activating system. And so the reticular activating system is the part that controls our alertness, how aware we are. And you'll notice that that's what's usually damaged when somebody's in a coma. And then the limbic system is this big group of things that have to do with emotions, right? And the reason these are listed here is because they're usually spread throughout. So there's parts of the reticular activating system in the medulla and the pons and the midbrain, I believe. And the limbic system is all the way from that hypothalamus all the way down. So it doesn't fit into one of these areas, but these are obviously really important things. All right, and the last piece to this video is going to be our cranial nerves, right? So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Altogether, they're given Roman numerals. So you'll see number 1 up here and number 12 down here, the hypoglossal. They all come off the brainstem except for smell. Smell comes directly out of the cerebrum. You can kind of see that here. But the rest of them all come off here, off of the brainstem in one way or another. We're going to get to see a few of these when we do the sheep brain dissections, but not all of them. And in terms of what they do, here's just a quick summary. I'm not going to have you guys memorize this year. I'm going to ask you to kind of get a feel for them, but you'll notice it carries like information like smell in or visual information in, or moves the eyes and focuses the eyes, moves the face or feels from the face, right? Chewing, mastication, big fancy word for chewing, moving the eyes again. So all of these things, if you'll notice, have to do kind of with the head. The only time you see an exception to that is you'll start to see this one here. The vagus nerve continues all the way down to some visceral organs, so it's involved in heart rate and some digestive stuff. And then the accessory nerve goes to like the neck and the upper back muscles. But the rest of them have to do with things that you would expect, all the things that connecting to the parts of your face and the ears and the eyes and things along those lines. All right, and that's going to wrap up the video tonight. I know it's a little longer than our usual ones, but we're only going to do 2 of them in this unit, so that should work out well. Tomorrow in class, what we'll do is we'll simplify this down. So we're going to take all of this information and turn it down into really about a page of the most important things that you're going to have to be responsible for the notes. So I did enhance this and make it a little more detailed than you're actually going to need to know come time for our quiz. All right, be prepared to ask questions in class tomorrow, and I will see you then.